Roasted dormice. Roasted dormice were one of the more tame entries on any Roman banquet menu, but the production process behind them is what earns this dish its spot on this list. Wealthy households kept live dormice in clay containers called gleraria, specially designed jars with breathing holes and internal shelves, where the animals were deliberately fattened in darkness before slaughter. The Roman writer Varro documented the practice, and archaeologists have recovered these jars intact from sites including Pompeii. Once fattened, the dormice were roasted whole, then stuffed with a mixture of pork and pine nuts, or simply dipped in honey and rolled in poppy seeds before serving. At Trimalchio's fictional banquet in the Satyricon, a row of dormice glazed in honey is served as one of the appetizer courses. It was a delicacy specifically because of how labour-intensive the fattening process was, not because the animal itself was considered repulsive, but behind that polished honey glaze was an entire industry built around farming rodents in the dark for the sole purpose of eating them whole, bones and all, which is a detail that gets considerably harder to stomach the deeper you look into how Roman aristocrats actually built their reputations at the dinner table. Sow's womb. Sow's womb, known in Latin sources as vulva, was considered a genuine delicacy among wealthy Romans, and the way it was produced reveals something specific about Roman culinary priorities. Pigs were either slaughtered before they had ever given birth or deliberately spayed, specifically to obtain a sterile womb considered superior in taste and texture to one that had carried piglets. Joseph Vailing, the scholar who translated the Apicius cookbook into English, documented this practice directly from the source material. It was served boiled, stuffed, or dressed simply with pepper, vinegar, or broth, depending on the occasion. The dish appears repeatedly enough in the historical record that it's clear this wasn't an isolated curiosity. Sow's womb was a standard luxury item on the Roman table, the kind of dish a host served specifically to demonstrate that they understood and could afford the finer distinctions of pork preparation. And once you start looking at which other reproductive and internal organs made repeated appearances on elite Roman menus, the womb starts to look less like an outlier and more like the opening act for something the Romans considered even more impressive. Stuffed pig's stomach. Stuffed pig's stomach took the entire emptied stomach lining of a pig and used it as a casing, filled with a rich mixture that could include minced meat, brains, eggs, and pine nuts, then sewn shut and either boiled or roasted whole. The Apicius cookbook documents this technique alongside several related preparations using other organ casings, the same logic that produces modern sausage, but scaled up to the size of an entire stomach and filled with a much richer mixture than anything in a typical sausage today. The stomach itself wasn't discarded as offal the way it often is in modern Western cooking. It was the centerpiece, valued specifically for its ability to hold a large, stuffed filling and its slightly chewy texture once cooked. This was practical Roman cooking taken to its most literal extreme, using every part of the animal, including container parts most modern diners would never consider eating at all. And it sets up a pattern you're going to see, repeated again and again, as we move toward dishes that treat the entire internal architecture of an animal as fair game. Goat and pig sweetbreads. Sweetbreads, the thymus gland and pancreas of young animals, were a standard ingredient in elite Roman kitchens, prepared from both goat and suckling pig. The Apicius cookbook lists them specifically among its catalogue of organ meats considered worth serving at a respectable table, distinct from the cheaper cuts that made up everyday meals for the lower classes. Sweetbreads have a soft, custard-like texture when properly cooked, which is part of why they remained a prized ingredient in European cuisine for centuries after Rome fell. Modern French cooking still treats riz de veau as a delicacy using essentially the same organ. What makes the Roman version notable is the sheer breadth of glandular tissue they considered standard fare. This wasn't an occasional indulgence, but a documented, repeated category in the only cookbook that survives from the period. And glands were just the beginning, because Roman cooks didn't stop at the soft tissue. They moved on to something with considerably more personality once it hit the plate. Capon testicles. Capon testicles, taken from castrated roosters, fattened specifically for the table, appear in the Apicius catalogue of organ meats served at elite Roman meals, listed plainly alongside chicken gizzards, blood, lungs, feet, and tails. The practice of castrating roosters to produce capons was widespread in Roman poultry farming, specifically because it produced more tender, fattier meat, and the testicles removed in that process weren't discarded. They were considered an edible byproduct worth preparing and serving. Historical sources documenting Roman eating habits list this matter-of-factly among a long inventory of animal parts that found their way onto wealthy dinner tables, treated with the same culinary seriousness as any other cut. The casualness with which Roman food writers catalogue this, right alongside more familiar cuts like liver and kidney, tells you something about how differently Romans drew the line between edible and inedible compared to most modern diners. And that line gets tested even further once you consider what they were doing with an animal's blood. Blood dishes. Blood was a standard cooking ingredient in Roman cuisine, not a rare or shocking inclusion, but a documented component across multiple dish categories, alongside lungs, tripe, kidneys, and gizzards in the broader Roman organ meat tradition. One of the most extreme single dishes recorded from antiquity, called the Shield of Minerva, was documented by the historian Suetonius as containing peacock and pheasant brains, the tongues of flamingos, pike liver, and lamprey blood combined into one elaborate composite dish. Blood-based preparations functioned similarly to how blood sausage or black pudding still function in several European cuisines today. Nothing about using blood as a cooking medium was unusual within the broader context of Roman or even later European food history. What makes this entry notable isn't blood by itself, but the company it kept. The dish that combined it with brain, tongue, and liver in a single course is widely considered one of the most extravagant single dishes recorded from the ancient world, and it's worth remembering that name because every part of that dish gets its own dedicated spot further down this list. Lamb and pig brains. Brain was one of the most frequently used ingredients in elite Roman cooking, appearing constantly in stuffings, sausages, and a category of layered dishes called patinae. One surviving Apicius recipe specifically combines lamb brain with eggs, pepper, and rose petals, producing a dish that was as visually decorative as it was unusual in concept. The texture of cooked brain is famously soft, almost custard-like, which made it useful as a binding and enriching agent in dishes that needed body without the chew of muscle meat. Brain appears so often across the Apicius text that food historians consider it one of the defining ingredients of high-end Roman cuisine, on par with garum or pepper in terms of frequency. It was, in other words, completely normalized, a default ingredient rather than a shock dish. But brain on its own wasn't the most prized neurological tissue on the Roman table. There was one part of an animal's head that Roman gourmands rated even more highly, and it didn't belong to a pig or a lamb at all. Flamingo tongue. Flamingo tongue was, according to Pliny the Elder, specifically praised by the Roman gourmand Apicius for having an exceptionally fine flavour, and it became one of the defining luxury foods of the Roman elite. The Apicius cookbook includes 2 separate recipes for roasted flamingo, with a footnote noting that parrot could be substituted using the identical method, a detail that tells you flamingo wasn't being treated as a singular novelty, but as a real, repeatable category of Roman fine dining. Acquiring flamingos required either trapping wild birds along Mediterranean coastlines or importing them from further south, making the dish expensive and logistically difficult before a single bird was even prepared. Once cooked, the tongue specifically was extracted and served as the prized component, while the rest of the bird was used in sauces and stews. No Roman source left behind a first-hand account of what flamingo tongue actually tasted like, which means the entire reputation of this dish rests on second-hand praise from a man notorious for spending himself into bankruptcy chasing rare delicacies. And acquiring an exotic bird's tongue wasn't even the most logistically absurd thing wealthy Romans were willing to do for a single course. Camel heel. Camel heel, recorded by Pliny the Elder as one of the specific delicacies recommended by Apicius, required sourcing and transporting an animal that doesn't naturally occur anywhere near Italy, butchering it specifically for one cut, then preparing that cut for a single elite meal. Unlike flamingo tongue, which at least involved a bird native to Mediterranean coastlines, Camel heel meant the entire animal had to be moved across enormous trade distances from North Africa or the Near East before a Roman cook could even begin preparing the dish. The heel itself is a tough, gelatinous, collagen-rich cut, the kind of tissue that requires extensive slow cooking to become edible at all, which means Roman kitchens had developed specific techniques just to make this niche delicacy palatable. Pliny records it directly alongside Flamingo Tongue as evidence of just how far Apicius was willing to go to discover and popularize the most exotic possible foods available to Roman wealth. It's a strange, narrow category of food, animal extremities sourced from thousands of miles away purely for the prestige of having eaten them. But even this wasn't the single most outrageous dish associated with extreme Roman banqueting. The Shield of Minerva. The Shield of Minerva is the dish this entire list has been building toward, and the historian Suetonius documented it in precise, unflinching detail. A single composite dish containing the brains of peacocks and pheasants, the tongues of flamingos, the livers of pike, and the blood of lampreys, all combined together and served as one extravagant course. Every component had already proven itself worth an entire entry on this list individually: brain, tongue, blood, and rare imported delicacies. And this dish stacked every single one of them into a single plate, specifically designed to demonstrate the absolute outer limit of what Roman wealth and culinary ambition could produce. It wasn't a fictional exaggeration from a satirist mocking excess. Suetonius recorded it as a real historical dish tied directly to the documented excesses of the late Roman imperial court. The sheer logistics behind assembling it in one sitting, sourcing 4 separate exotic ingredients, each requiring its own specialized preparation, then combining them into a single unified course, represents the absolute peak of what Roman banqueting culture was willing to attempt purely to prove a point about wealth, power, and culinary dominance. Nothing else on this list comes close to matching its combination of scale, cost, and sheer audacity. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. More fascinating stories about foods from history are coming soon.